Okay, so I touched on a little bit this idea of an approach to international or modernist architecture that is more expressionist. And also, we're going to see some example of a more regional approach to modernism. So expressionist architecture, and I described that a little bit, it's really more of a personal statement by the architect, and it becomes unique to either the project or the site or both. And it's meant to evoke really strong feelings and emotions using the forms and the expression of the architecture itself, not ornament. We're not applying ornamentation to the building, right? This is modernism, but like we saw with Eero Saarinen's TWA terminal, evoking the concept of flight, that you're about to take off into the sky like a bird, and you're going to do that through a building that sort of is evocative of a bird taking flight. That is what I mean by expressionist architecture, and we're going to see some other examples here as well. And it becomes pretty popular, especially really in the 1960s and 70s. It's still the modernist aesthetic, but it's not the rectilinear, plain squares and rectangles of the Miesian approach to architecture. And then regional modernism is the idea of that in different parts of the world, architects would adapt the modernist aesthetic using local materials or design approaches, the use of space, and how they formed their buildings to create an architecture that was modern but still felt rooted in that region. And for some people, some architects or some regions, this is important. They want an architecture that doesn't look like it could be set anywhere. And it's one of the criticisms of modernism, right? And that was the thing they were creating, like an architecture that is universal and it can be used anywhere, but that doesn't always play. People say, well, I want an architecture that reflects my values and my region and territory. And so we start to see in the 60s and 70s, architects began to do that. And we'll see a few nice examples here as well. So the first example of a expressionist architecture is really probably the first expression of it, or first use of expressionist architecture, and that's the Einstein Tower in Potsdam. Eric Mendelsohn, we talked about briefly. He was an early adapter of Bauhaus modernism, but here he breaks out of that mold and to create an observatory that is very sculptural. It's this beautiful little piece of sculpture. It's not very big, actually. When I finally saw it 10 years ago or so, I was like, oh, that's it? I mean, I was really impressed. I love this building. I've seen it in architectural classes and books and all this time, but then it was kind of like, oh, it's a lot smaller than I thought it would be, which happens sometimes, but it's a really beautiful sculptural plastic form. He wanted to do this in concrete, but the client couldn't afford that, so he wound up doing it in brick and then sort of covering it all with stucco, which allowed him to kind of create this molded plastic form. And it's called Einstein Tower just because it's a scientific site and Einstein was famous, and so they thought, let's call it after Einstein. I don't think it had anything to do with the center here. This is a little sketch that he did of the concept. I think this is one of the most beautiful design concept sketches I've ever seen, and it essentially carries that out in reality. And here's a front view of it. Like I say, it's very small and tiny. This is just an observatory. You can see up here at the top. Let me get the pointer. Here at the top is the observatory element itself, and so there's just a few little research rooms and so forth to support that. But that's all it is. It's just a tower for that. So it's this kind of cute little thing. But we'll skip ahead a little bit to the post-war period and back to SOM, and a major architect that worked with them was Walter Netsch. So he spent most of his career at SOM and worked largely in the Miesian style, and we're going to see a little bit of that. But one of his signature works is more expressionist, and I don't think much of Walter Netsch as an architect. I think he was a bad Miesian follower in his detailing and so forth. If you've been to the Circle campus of the University of Illinois, you might know what I'm talking about. Or you've seen a couple of buildings that designed at IIT, you would definitely know what I'm talking about. But this is the Academy, the Air Force Academy, and especially the chapel there is really brilliant. So this was designed 1962. This is in Colorado Springs at the Air Force Academy. He designs the plan and the campus for the whole academy, which generally speaking is Miesian. It's square, rectangular, Miesian architecture. But the chapel he makes expressionist. And he's trying to express three things here. He's sort of being evocative of the concept of especially a Gothic cathedral, the soaring vertical cathedral that is very spiritual and inspirational, but also picking up on the backdrop, which is the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And so his exterior expression is meant to sort of be evocative of these peaks of the Rocky Mountains. And it's the Air Force Academy, and they're flying these high-speed fighter jets, and they're also somewhat, the form is evocative of the fighter jet as well. And I think you'll see all three of those things as we quickly walk through this. So he uses these sort of bent plate forms to create these triangular ribs that really jut out dramatically into the sky, that are very, I think, really reflective of that soaring, pointed arched vaults of Gothic cathedrals. We see that a little bit here, but I think we also see, the airplane, right? This jet airplane form is in here a little bit. And it's not literal. It's not meant to look like an airplane, but, if you're a cadet and you're, going to be flying these things, you're like, hey, that's kind of cool. It reminds me of the jet plane that I'm going to be flying in. And then this view down here, I think, is also a bit of a tie to the flying buttresses of Gothic cathedrals. Not literal in any way, but this idea of these concrete forms coming out at the angle, and they're supporting the vaults of this church here. And once you go inside, I think it really feels like a modern Gothic cathedral. The soaring vertical pointed vaults with beautiful art glass. He literally has colored glass in between these folded forms that really creates this beautiful colored light and a really spiritual illuminated wall at the end behind the altar, I think, is kind of almost evocative of the Baroque period of light coming in behind the altar, the way the Baroque architects would do. Here's a side view of some of the colors, stained glass. So again, no way is he going to dual interpretation of a Gothic cathedral, but that's essentially what he has created here. So an early both expressionist and regional modern architect is Alvar Aalto out of Finland. So Eliel Saarinen was another Finnish architect. He comes to America. Aalto stays in Finland. He's kind of the next generation after Saarinen, and really adapts in the 30s the idea of modernism and so forth, and slowly adapts it over time. But he really wants his architecture to feel like it belongs in Finland. And an early project, which is much more pure international style, is the Sanatorium in Paimo from 1929-1933. So it's still early in this Bauhaus era. But even in this aerial view, you see that he is being somewhat expressive in the sense that in a sanitarium, natural light, natural air, getting plenty of fresh ventilation, and views to sort of morally uplift the patients are all important. So he spreads this building out and gives everyone a view and a vista and plenty of fresh air and light. And that's about all they could do for tuberculosis at the time. There was no cure for it back then. And so just a few examples you can see in the plan how he really spreads this out, and everything's on a different angle. This is not orthogonal in any way, so it's almost reaching into expressionism, but it's doing it because he wants to have everyone to have a view and a vista that isn't just looking back, at the neighbor, across the courtyard from you. Here's a view of the balconies that he creates, and so that people could come out, sit, and get plenty of fresh air. And even some of the furniture he designs for it is meant to be beneficial to the TB patients here. So the chair that he designs, very modern, very sleek, but it's meant to allow a person to sit in just the right way that they can breathe a little easier, which is hard to do when you have TB. And the rooms are designed to allow plenty of fresh air, but also natural light to come in, and that helps people feel better. You know, even if they aren't physically defeating TB, they might just feel a little better while they have it. His own home and studio is also a place for experimentation. He builds his house and a small studio in the 1930s, and then a new studio in the 1950s. This is in Helsinki. And this is the exterior of his house. This is the front entrance. So very modernist, very Bauhaus, the white monolithic facade, punched windows just set right in there, and just a very simple door, you know, not a big elaborate classical portico, right? But look at the woodwork, especially here on the garage door, but I'm especially on this bay right here. Just natural wood from the region, cut and left untreated, that it will sort of meld into this gray color that wood does. And this is not something we've seen, right? You know, Mies wasn't doing this, Gropius wasn't doing this, but Aalto, in a site like Finland, which has abundance of trees, says, hey, this is important to us and we're going to use that. And we see it on the back as well. We see more of that wood balcony area here, but also, which helps it fit into the trees around it, but also look at the way he uses the site. He takes the boulders, the granite, dark granite boulders, and he creates a garden wall that helps to raise the building up a little bit higher off the ground. And we'll see how he uses this stonework in some of his other buildings in a moment. This is the interior, a more traditional, you know, Scandinavian aesthetic on the interior. I'm going to kind of just flip through some of these quickly. This was the studio adjacent to his home, or connected to it. So in the 1930s, he had a smaller practice with just a few people. This was his desk here in the back. This was one of my favorite spots to stand or to sit at his desk and look out this corner window like this. I was like, oh, I wish my office looked like that. But then lots of light. This is something very important in a northern climate like Finland, where, you know, in the winter, fall and winter, there's very little light, right? So having large windows placed just right to maximize that is very important, and Aalto is a master at that. This is the studio that he designs in 1955. This is separate. It's a few blocks away from his home, and his practice takes off in the post-war period, and it grows. And so he has a brand new studio built. And this is the way he integrates his building into the landscape of Finland here. He creates a little bit of an amphitheater, and he uses that black stone, you know, to create the levels of the amphitheater, but he has this curvature in the wall, even both in the wall plane, but also in the roof line here, that picks up the curvature of the amphitheater. So he's moving into a little more of an expressionist mode of architecture. Even though we have the monolithic white wall, we have the ribbon window that Corbu had really promoted, we see the aspects of Bauhaus architecture, but we also see something that is unique to Aalto, unique to Finland. The interior is pretty fantastic. This is that curved space. This is almost, it's more like Aalto's office area and sample room. So he's got light fixtures hanging up here and models and all kinds of stuff going on in this space. And clients could come in here and he could impress them with some of the work that they are doing. This is one of the studios here. And this reminds me a little bit of Taliesin West. These girders, right, that come up and angle down, that allows a transom or clerestory window to let in lots of light come into this space, really is evocative of Taliesin West. And, you know, whether he was directly influenced by that, I don't know for sure, but he probably for sure had seen publications of that. And this is the conference room, and I love this space when I visited it, because it's a general conference room, right? You know, 4 walls, a ceiling, you got some light fixtures hanging down, but this angled display wall was beautifully illuminated, and I thought, oh, wow, that's really nicely lit. I got a couple of views. So, you know, you could really get it to move forward. Here we are. You could really see how a client would, you know, come over and be very impressed with the beautiful drawings of this project that he put. And I walked over and I looked up and I'm like, oh my God, there's a little mini skylight above this to let the light cascade down. That's where most of the light is coming from, at least during the daytime. At night, there's some light fixtures you can turn on, but that beautiful, warm, soft light is coming from these little skylights. And I was just blown away by that small little detail. Probably his most famous work in Finland is Finlandia Hall. This is from 1962, finished in 71 in various stages. This is in Helsinki. And this is both expressionist and regional. He's expressing the fact that there's a big concert hall, and you see the auditorium form out here very well expressed. There's no question about where that is. But otherwise, there's a lot of Kabru Bauhaus style. There's a ribbon window along here, a white monolithic form. It's not really raised up on pilotis, but this balcony canopy here with the columns gives a little bit of the sense of pilotis. But if you walk around to the back, you can see how he anchors this to the ground. Unlike Corbusier, who raises the building up off the ground and it can be set anywhere, anyhow, right? Here, Aalto anchors his building solidly to the ground. So on the left, we see the actual granite of the hillside that is cut away, and then he takes that stone and he hones it, you know, cuts it and hones it, and he makes that the base of his building. And then that transitions into the white monolithic of the marble walls. Ironically, being a regional architect and sort of anchoring his building with this black granite, he uses a white Carrara Italian marble, which is not regional to Finland at all. And you notice that it's almost basket weave or pillowed here. That is because it's not meant to be. It's because the thin marble panels in the cold climate of Finland, they begin to warp out over time, and they have to replace this marble every, I don't know, 20 years or so because it gets really warped like that. Okay, I think we will stop here. One last view of Finlandia Hall here. The backside, another area where we see these curved forms. Again, very expressionist that show not just a monolithic flat slab, you know, the Bauhaus was famous for, but something much more expressive here. So that is also characteristic of Aalto. So with that, I will stop.